Are live. Hello, everybody. My name's Robert Douglas, and this is Deploy Friday, brought to you by Platform.sh. This is the webcast for the curious to learn about the hottest new internet technologies and the people behind them, and for those who are brave enough to deploy on Fridays with confidence. In this episode, we're going to learn about deploying JAMStack applications to Netlify, how to use more traditional CMS applications like Drupal or Sitecore in a decoupled world, and what the differences are between Gatsby and Next.js. And we have with me today my colleague, Chad Carlson. Hey, Chad.
Hey, how's it going?
Great, thank you. And from the Netlify team, we have two very esteemed guests, Cassidy Williams and Jason Lengstorf. And I'm going to give both of you a chance to introduce yourselves. Jason, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm Jason. I work on the developer experience team with Cassidy at Netlify. Prior to that, I worked at Gatsby. I've worked at IBM. I've been an independent educator. And I just like doing silly stuff on the internet with code.
We all do. Thank you. Awesome. Cassidy.
I'm just going to copy Jason's bio. I'm also over at Netlify working with Jason, and I primarily do React and Next.js. And I really like making silly things on the internet with code.
That's what keeps the internet beautiful.
Mm.
All right. So let's get right into it, because while I presume a lot of people in the audience today will already have their minds around JAMStack and Netlify a little bit, it's always good to start at the beginning and get those definitions out there. So Jason, could I ask you to maybe present JAMStack as a concept and how it fits into the evolution of publishing on the web?
Sure. So the JAMStack is... It has traditionally been described as a stack, which is how it got its name, but it's honestly not a stack at all. So it ends up being a silly name for an architecture. So JAMStack is actually more similar to something like monolithic apps or microservices in the sense that it's a way of organizing your code. So the JAMStack architecture is going to, instead of building a microservice where you've got a front end and a back end and everything bundled up into one small service that does one thing, you're instead abstracting your front end to being a layer of static assets that can be deployed to a CDN. And any interactivity that needs to happen is going to happen through asynchronous calls to APIs or your own databases or a software as a service platform or whatever it is that you need in the back. And the majority, like any data that doesn't update frequently, gets preloaded and built once at build time before deployment, so that you have better stability. You don't have to worry about your servers getting overloaded and going down. You can hit the front page of everything on the internet and drag, millions of simultaneous visitors. And that can't overwhelm your database. It can't overwhelm your server because you're not actually rendering things at the time that people request it. You rendered it in advance. So it's a way of moving work forward so that the developer builds once instead of each user needing to build every time the page is requested. And it also abstracts the placement of things so that your front end is a discrete static entity that sits in front on a CDN, and your business logic and your data is a separate service that exists through API endpoints or database connections. So it helps with separation of concerns, which also boosts your build velocity as well, because teams don't have to deal with like untangling that middle layer where things touch.
So everything dynamic on a website like that has to be done in the client. Is that right?
Not necessarily, because like you would do as much as you can ahead of time, and you can do quite a bit ahead of time. But then when you get to the dynamic part, you might just be asking a serverless function. You're saying like, hey, do a dynamic thing. So it still happens on a server. It just gets passed asynchronously. And really the only difference is that instead of waiting for a page load, you see a loading spinner. It's fundamentally the same outcome and the same amount of work. It's just what you're looking at while you're waiting. So in a server rendered environment, you'd be looking at a blank page while that work gets done. In a JAMStack environment, you'd be looking at the skeleton of the page with like a loading indicator for just the piece that's loaded dynamically while you could still see everything else on the page.
Now, I have to comment at this point that it reminds me a lot of the argument that we used to give for server-side includes or components that had callbacks, like the quintessential example was an e-commerce site where the entire front page could be cached with all the products and the prices and the marketing stuff, but your basket up at the top had to be personalized. So we'd load the whole e-commerce page and then like Ajax that little sucker in up there. What's the difference?
The only difference is that instead of the server side, like if you were doing that with a server rendered site, then that page that gets cached, you have to load that once in a user's browser in order for it to get cached. You also have to manage that you have an origin server, and then you have your caching layer, and then you have browsers. And there are places where that can break down. Your cache could go invalid, and then the server is overloaded when you go to create the new version, so your site fails to render entirely, or your client could miss it. Like there's lots of ways that servers can get overwhelmed. Whereas with a CDN, CDNs are you're basically generating that cache once, and you're saying, I've generated the cache, and that's what I'm delivering. I'm not giving you a server. The other major benefit is you can't hack a generated asset. It's, you can deface it, but there is no server access. There is no database access. So the worst damage you can do is to go make the site look bad until they re-upload the clean copy. So it's effectively the same thing. You're just moving the goalpost for where the work is done and limiting access to resources.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Cassidy, how does Netlify promote this architecture, and what does the service do in some broad strokes?
So Netlify, one of the founders coined the term, and so we're very, very big on the architecture, and one of our teammates has written a book on the subject, and we help maintain jamstack.org and then the big Jamstack Slack community and stuff. And so we're very active in the Jamstack space. Oh, and help organize Jamstack Conf as well. And so if we can help the Jamstack community, we try to do that as much as we can. And what Netlify does is the very, very, very short way of saying it is we'll host Jamstack applications. But the longer form is not only do we host it, but we also have a ton of different features that make it easy for the developer to maintain Jamstack applications. And so we have cool features, for example, like form management, where if you add just a Netlify attribute to an HTML form, it'll automatically gather all of your responses for you. So you don't have to set up a whole backend or whatever to gather your form responses. We also have things like split testing, where you can put different branches and point them to different users or a certain percentage of users, and you can see how your results are going. We have cool things like deploy previews, where on a given PR, you can see what your actual deploy is going to look like before pushing it live. And so you can make sure everything looks good from kind of a user testing perspective on your team. We've got analytics. We've got the ability to put in environment variables and serverless functions. We have snippet injection, where you can put in different snippets of code into your applications without actually having to include it in your code itself. We've got a lot of cool different features that I could go on, but I'm cutting myself off, that are really pretty dang free for people. Even before working at Netlify, I never actually paid for it because it was able to do so much for me. And we actually just came out with a new pricing plan 3 weeks ago, Jason, something like that, where it's actually, it was originally to start on a pro plan to pay for more features. It was $45, but now it's only $19 a month, where you can have even more of all of these features. And so that's what we provide.
Awesome. So one of the things that I tested that 2 years ago, okay, and was really amazed that I could just drag and drop a bunch of HTML files or JavaScript files from my desktop into a little uploader on your front page, and boom, it was all deployed. And I thought it was really cute and very exciting. Currently working at a hosting company, I didn't actually start using it for my own sites, but then I did see in prepping for this that you work with a number of more traditional CMSs like Sitecore and Drupal, and I was really curious about that because one of the things that I had taken away from Netlify when I was looking at it the first couple times is that it was basically, you know, the back end data type things like databases, aside from the helper form collector. Those are basically things that you're going to want to conceive of as API calls and web services and host them elsewhere. So it could be, you know, something on Amazon Cloud as a database service, or MySQL you spin up, or a Mongo that you spin up and give access with a API proxy, or just, you know, whatever API you've got, you're going to query that with your code and either server-side render it if it's available then, or client-side render it. That's basically right, isn't it? So how do you do Drupal and Sitecore?
I'll take that. So you would do that by effectively hosting it somewhere else, right? So you can set up a DigitalOcean droplet. You can put it up on Heroku. You can put it up on whatever hosting platform, Platform.sh. And then Drupal will run in what they call decoupled mode, or WordPress will run in headless mode through the WordPress API, or WP GraphQL, which is a really cool plugin, or it's a plugin maintained by Jason Ball that will expose a REST endpoint or a GraphQL endpoint for your chosen CMS. Most headless CMSs like Contentful, Sanity, Graph CMS, they're all being done with that API model kind of baked in. They don't offer a front end, they just offer the endpoint. And so from a Netlify standpoint, you'll use whatever site tool you want, whether you want to use something that kind of has a data layer baked in, like Gridsome or Gatsby, or I think Nux can do that a little bit. Or if you want to kind of roll your own data loading through something like Next or 11D, then you will pull that in at build time. And then once you're done, you don't actually need access to that server for the static content. So if you're using WordPress and it's just for blog content, you would pull that blog content at build time, ship your site, and then you can actually shut down that WordPress site. So in theory, you could actually run it on your local computer to run a build, and then push that built file up to Netlify and never have to keep a running instance of your server, because it's not actually
great for solo developers, maybe not the team solution.
So if you're just getting started and you don't want to pay the $5-10 a month for hosting, and you just want to get something up on Netlify, you could run your site server, like the WordPress instance, Drupal instance, whatever, on your local computer. I wouldn't recommend that. I think that the amount of hassle and headache that's going to lead to is not worth the $5 you'll save. But it is definitely an option, and it's a way to get started if you need to get out the gate.
So the question was a bit disingenuous because I did know a little bit of the answer in advance, because we actually have clients telling us that they're running Drupal and WordPress on Platform.sh and then deploying the front on Netlify. So I knew in advance that actually that's a great coupling that we have visibility into in our customer base as actually using. So thanks for confirming that. Chad, you had a question?
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to get into some of the differences between Gatsby and Next. I know that we've had some conversations from people with Gatsby, and I've got a decent amount of experience of working with Gatsby and running this decoupled setup, and we can kind of run the app containers on the same project, but the way of actually integrating it into that build step and into that data layer is fairly straightforward. You have a source plugin that you make a part of your code base on Gatsby. What does that kind of look like in Next by comparison? You're a little bit more on your own to set up those API functions and set up that build?
Yeah, so on your own is the perfect way to describe it, because it's just flexible enough where you can kind of do quite a bit with it, because all Next is it gives you some structure to your React, but it is pretty dang close to what React is, because the only real structure that it provides is that there's a pages directory, and every file in the pages directory is a route. And so you can make API routes in that pages directory and make that work. Something that I did in one of my CMS projects is I made some custom hooks that pull in different posts, and then I call them in. There's a function called get static props that builds at build time and loads it directly into the page. So that way you don't have to call it client side, but at the same time you can call it client side, and you can fetch it right in the page as if you were doing it in some kind of vanilla React application. And so you have quite a few different options for CMSs, and it's kind of up to you how you want to structure it. It's a very free-form framework, but the most typical solution you'll see is someone making some kind of util, helper, hook, function, file thing that pulls in all the posts, and it's actually called in that get static props thing, so that way it can be rendered onto the page at build time.
Right, that's what I've seen a lot. I know that recently I had deployed a Gatsby Strappy multi-app that they have their own plugin. And for Next, I have a lib subdirectory with a couple of functions that do get pulled into that get static props call. What's your feeling, I guess, on that approach? It's a little bit more on your own for Next. Do you like the kind of simplified API and a little bit more control, as opposed to maybe depending on the community and learning a specific plugin and potentially being restricted by that a little bit?
Depends on how you define restricted, because some people might consider themselves being restricted by not having any surefire choices made for them or anything. And so I don't want to just answer things with it depends, but it's kind of true.
Right.
For myself, it took me a long time to even try Next or any other frameworks, because I really liked vanilla JavaScript for a long time, and then I really liked vanilla React for a really long time. And so for myself, going to Next, because it makes almost no decisions for me, I like that, and that might be me being a control freak about my code, but I like being able to have the flexibility to change my mind how architecture should be.
Yeah, I think I would say that it's a lot of it is going to depend on who's working on the project, right? So like when you work on your own, you want whatever the thing is that you enjoy doing. So when I'm working solo, I love to start with just vanilla JavaScript and see how far I can go, because it's fun to use vanilla JavaScript. But when I'm working on a team, if my whole team knows Gatsby or my whole team knows Next, we're going to use whatever everybody knows. And if I'm going to roll this out across a company, I'm probably going to go with something that maybe I don't even like, but that I know enforces good behavior. So like, that's why I think Angular is so popular in the enterprise community, is because Angular is very, very prescriptive about the way that you do things. There's a process. You must follow the process or Angular will complain. And there are CLIs to generate everything. There's a ton of boilerplate. And I think that like where Gatsby is strong is that Gatsby is very prescriptive and very well documented about the way that you get data in. So if you inherit a Gatsby site, you're not going to have any questions about where the data comes from. You know, you're going to go to Gatsby config. You know it's going to be in the GraphQL layer. You know that you're going to be looking for these functions. Whereas in something like Next, you would need a handoff. Somebody would have to say, well, this is the way we load the data. It's over in this file. We use this library to do it. So it all kind of depends on like, how does knowledge transfer in your company? How many people does it need to transfer to? Is this something that needs to grow beyond you as a developer? Like, are you going to set this up and then leave in 2 years and this is still going to live in the company for 5 years after that? Because if that's the case, you might want to use something that has way more opinions and external documentation versus something that's just fun to build. And so I think that those are the sorts of trade-offs that I'm looking at when I make a decision about what sort of framework I want to introduce.
Is Next potentially more fun to build without that part to it?
I mean,
it depends.
Like what's fun about Gatsby is that Gatsby is like the mental model of working in Gatsby is really interesting, because what you're doing is you're taking data from literally any source. It could be like, you can load data from a file, you can load data from a SQL database, you can load it from, an API, software as a service, anywhere. And then you're going to map that data, like write an adapter for it that puts it into this GraphQL model. That is cool. Like it's fun to do those types of mental exercises where you're trying to think, well, how does an image feel the same as a WordPress post when I put it into a data layer? But that is how it works, and that is how it functions. And then you get these kind of interconnections where a WordPress post is going to reference images. So how do I make sure that the images from a WordPress post work the same as the images from my local system? And you can do that in Gatsby. There's pathways. You just have to kind of jump through the Gatsby way of doing it. And if you think through that, it's really powerful and it's really fun. In the next side of things, I've always really liked that it's completely whatever you want to do. Like, so it gets back to that like blank sheet. What would you create if you could create anything? And that's a different kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Sun has come out, so I'm going to lower my camera brightness because now you can see me.
Have a camera brightness on the actual physical device?
That's a real camera.
It's a real camera.
Wow. Okay, I'm really gonna have to up my game after this, and get my stuffed animal is gonna have to make an emergence too.
Mm.
I mean, Chad's got his exercise ball. You've got your dinosaur, your Barney. Is that a Barney?
Oh no, that's Charmander. It's a Pokemon.
Charmander. Oh, that's a Pokemon. Okay. Oh, I even played that game for a while. I'm embarrassed. Okay, so I just lost all credibility in the Pokemon world.
You kind of did.
I did. Barney.
That's a shame.
Okay. I was hoping that one of you would take the task of explaining for the audience the entire workflow that happens with GitHub and Netlify auth, or identity, I think it's called. Because I've found that to be actually quite cunning, and from the outside looking in, it's not something that's apparent to people evaluating the service, or they don't understand quite how cool it works when you actually go through the workflow. So could one of you take that and describe it?
How Netlify identity works with GitHub?
Yeah, when you're setting up a project and, the creation of the GitHub project, and then that actually deploys it. And then when you go to I'm doing it for you.
I'm setting up one of the templates for the first time.
Yeah, and then you go to the admin section of the Gatsby application.
So, all those things. So yeah. One of the, I think that there's a little bit of crossing over of what's actually happening here. But so that's why I was a little bit of confused there. But there's a cool thing that actually Jason and my team work on. It's called the Netlify identity widget. And so if you'd like to integrate some kind of auth into your applications, we have this widget where you can drop it in and go, and you can do it in any framework or just straight up HTML, CSS, JavaScript if you want. And what's cool about it is it sets up authentication for you with our APIs on our end. And so what you can do on the Netlify admin side is you can set up different roles. You can have role-based redirects. You can do all kinds of things where when someone logs in with GitHub, with some service, or just with, the email and password, it can redirect you. It can log you in, and you can have gated content. Jason has done tons of awesome blog posts on that. And yeah, you can basically do a lot of setup without actually having to touch the GitHub side of things at all. It's just in your code base and then in your Netlify admin panel if you want to have, for example, open registration or invite only registration, and set up all kinds of auth things without actually having to build your own auth service yourself.
So I totally used the wrong word for what I was describing. So that's a cool feature. What was I actually talking about?
Were you talking about when you initially sign up for Netlify and create a new site?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I'll do a speed run on that. So so the way that Netlify works is Netlify is a deployment platform that it's like multi-cloud. So it'll put you on a combination of Fastly and GCP and AWS and all the major CDNs. And it is also a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment tool. So you can run your tests and things like that. And the way that we do that is that when you set up your Netlify account, you're able to attach a GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket repo. We support self-hosted GitLab and GitHub as well if you're an enterprise team. And you can say, I want a Netlify site connected to this repository. And then whenever you push a change to that repository, we listen to that and we will automatically kick off a new build for your site. And if it's the production branch, we'll push that live. So effectively, whenever you make a change to your code base, we'll take those changes live for you with all of your tests, with your whole CI/CD run kind of as part of the deployment. We also will listen for, if you set it up, individual branches. So if you've got your production branch, your staging branch, your QA branch, we can independently build all of those at different subdomains. Only the production branch is Google crawlable, so you don't get any SEO penalties or anything like that. And you can password protect them if you want, so that if you want your staging branch to require a password before you go and view it, you can set that up. We also, whenever you open a pull request, will create a deploy preview from that pull request so that you can see the changes in progress before you merge them. So that's a great way to get discussion and feedback from, if you're working with a content team, if you're working with legal, if you're working with marketing, you can make your changes and then actually send them a live site that's like, this is what I did, instead of playing the screenshot bingo game where you have to send them a screenshot and then they draw on the screenshot and then you try to make those changes and then send them another screenshot. Instead, you can actually send them the working site and, they'll take a screenshot of that and mark it up.
Exactly. And we recognize the value of that, providing similar stuff with Platform.sh. That's just one of the most awesome advances in developer productivity that you can imagine, because we frame it in terms of the context switch phenomenon. If I'm a developer and I've been tasked with fixing something, and I have to work into the problem and understand all the business motivations and all of the parameters and find the bug and think of a fix for the bug, and I've got all this contextual zone that I get into, and I make my PR, and then I walk away from it, my knowledge of what I just did has a half-life. And it goes down and down and down and down as time goes on. So there's a huge motivation to get the feedback for my work very quickly from the stakeholders, rather than wait until I've forgotten that I even did it. And if you can just send the URL in Slack or an email and say, please review this and tell me what you think, then you're likely to get feedback really quickly. Whereas if you have to wait till the staging server is free, then you might never get there.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you touched on something else that I think is really important, which is that, you want to switch as few contexts as you can when you're trying to get things done. Like if I have to work in my code and then I have to push my code somewhere and then I have to log into another service and kick off a build, and then I have to go over somewhere else to get it sent to my team, that's a huge pain. Whereas if I'm already working in GitHub and I push up changes, Netlify, when you get your deploy preview, it'll add a comment to your pull request that says, here's the deploy preview. So you'll just get a notification that you can forward that GitHub notification to your marketing team and say, hey, go look at this. Or you can tag them in a GitHub comment and say, hey, can you add your review to this? And all of the context that you need is right there where you're working. You're in your code editor, you're on GitHub, just like you were going to be anyways. And you don't have to go other places to do other parts of your job. You can consolidate that whole workflow.
great, thank you. I'm going to address some of the questions that are coming in.
I was going to say, we've got some comments in the chat.
We sure do. I'm going to start with Stefan Adolf, who's probably tuning in from Berlin. Hi, Stefan. Stefan's a Gatsby fan, unmatched in terms of site building productivity. Stefan writes, unfortunately, the latest PR and I guess public relations, not pull request, isn't that good. It's kind of unclear where the project is heading towards. Do either of you know what the heck he's talking about?
Yeah. So I'm gonna speak very delicately about this because I used to work at Gatsby. I don't want to throw any of my former coworkers under the bus or anything. But there's a shakeup in the community over leadership at Gatsby. And there have been some missteps that were cataloged by Nat Allison. If you want to find that on Twitter, there's going to be a big thread that kind of goes into all the details. And the company internally is kind of discussing how to handle that because the employees feel one way and they're asking leadership to respond. And so that's kind of like I think there's like degrees of issues in companies, right? Like every company has issues, and no company is going to come out unscathed. And I think that some of it is just, when you have startup companies, you have people who have never been leaders, potentially never worked on teams, who are suddenly given a big bucket of money and told to build a team, and they have to learn really, really fast. And I think that at Gatsby, what we're seeing is a failure to learn fast enough. And so they have to make a decision now what they're going to do going forward, if they're going to switch up leadership, if they're going to change their direction, how they're going to approach that problem.
So this is a case for cooking up a big bowl of popcorn and sitting back and watching, or is this a case for retooling?
I mean, I don't think the framework is going anywhere. Like, it's still an incredibly popular framework that tons of enterprises use, developers use. The ecosystem is huge. So
Yes.
I don't think this is the kind of thing where you're just like, okay, I have to convert all my code now. I think this is a very classic startup case of growing pains. And I can't tell you how many startups I've seen that have gone through something like this, where whether it's publicly or privately, someone's calling out leadership for, like Jason said, not learning fast enough. And a very technical person becoming a leader and having to learn how to deal with people and not treat them like blocks of code. And that's something that I think a lot of leaders have to go through. And I don't think that Gatsby is going anywhere. I just think that they're rapidly learning in public now on how to improve the corporate side of things. But I think the community is still pretty dang strong.
That's good to hear.
I think like the other thing too is, it's retooling is a tricky thing, especially in the React space, because if you were retooling, you'd be retooling because Gatsby is a VC funded open source company and you don't trust that direction. But then where do you go? Because Next is a VC funded open source framework that is going to have all of the same challenges. And React is a Facebook funded open source framework. So like if you're going to stay in the React ecosystem, you're not like, oh, I'm going to find the ethical framework. Like there's no, it's kind of comes back to that aphorism of like, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. You have to make the trade-offs of like, what are you trying to do? And like, what harm are you specifically enabling when you make a decision about what tooling you're using? But I don't think the frameworks themselves are going to see any like significant degradation. The worst case scenario is that they just kind of like plateau, but they're still good now, right? So like you could continue to use Gatsby with no updates for quite a while and be happy with it.
Stefan admits to wearing Gatsby socks.
I might be wearing Gatsby socks right now too.
Even at this very moment.
I bet I have some somewhere.
Socks are just about the best swag. So somebody mentioned bamboo and would be happy to know the differences. Now, I don't know bamboo, so who can work backwards into the context of that question and maybe speak to it?
Does anyone know what bamboo is?
I think they were just saying that they're happy to know about the differences between different frameworks, just like the differences between different types of bamboo. I think that's what that comment means.
Between different types of bamboo? I didn't know.
Yeah,
like
I
the
don't
plant?
think. Yeah, I think it's like the plant. I don't actually think that there's a framework called bamboo.
It's in different places in the world. It's not an apples to apples comparison. It's a bamboo to bamboo comparison. I see.
Yes.
Barak, you asked that question. If you'd like to clarify, go ahead. We'll move on.
That's the stuff that pandas eat. Yes, Elias,
Yes.
that is
Correct.
Thanks a lot.
So, Chad, when we were investigating, what was your next question?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to take the opportunity to move into the Netlify CMS, and that's played a role in the history of Netlify. And I had some time over the course of this week to not just play with it on Netlify itself, which I found pretty interesting, especially in combination with identity, where I can literally start a template, authenticate, allow it to generate the repo on my own account, and then automatically start having some control over the content that's posted on my site that results in PRs being opened for me that generate those preview URLs that I can access directly from a handy dandy link inside of my admin panel, or send to somebody for editorial review. Part of that also is because I work at Platform, so a lot of my experimentation then was, okay, it says in the docs that I can deploy this myself without using Netlify. And I found myself at this identity authentication layer coming up against some troubles, or at least trying to figure out the right way to approach it. That in the documentation, I can see something like using an external auth library, or maybe trying to serve GoTrue myself. Maybe we could talk about what Netlify CMS, what your guys' relationship with it has been, and maybe what you've seen in terms of people using it outside of Netlify.
Also, bamboo isn't the plant, and I feel foolish. It's an Atlassian thing. So setting up authentication using something outside of like Netlify identity or something like that.
Yeah, that I think the GoTrue is sort of behind identity, right? And that's an open source project in itself that I'm curious all on its own that you have this big stress on JavaScript and all these open source libraries behind them all with Go. And I'm really interested in Go. But what you've seen in terms of people trying to take this CMS, which to me was a little unexpected, honestly, when I saw that I could make a content edit on my admin panel on a production site, and that created a PR for me. I found that unexpected when I was initially looking at it. Yeah, I'm curious what your experience has been with people using that kind of model maybe, and then what it's been seeing people trying to deploy it themselves outside of Netlify.
I haven't, so I'm relatively new to the team. I joined in April. So I haven't actually seen a lot of people outside of Netlify doing that, but internally, that's actually how we write our blog posts and stuff for Netlify itself. And it's kind of nice having the PR version, because we'll write our posts in the CMS and everything and have that nice GUI. But then when we have the PRs, we can ask for a code review kind of and actually use the tools that GitHub provides. And that's really nice, because when I say like, Jason, please look at this blog post of mine, he doesn't have to go into the CMS and log through everything. He can say, hey, on this line, fix this, on this line, fix this. And he can make either some kind of commit on my PR or just make comments on it. And so we can treat each post as a pull request rather than just as something that needs to be edited in the CMS. And so that's something that I personally really like about that aspect of it.
Yeah, I also like, we have the concept of open authoring on the Netlify CMS, which is a way that you can say, like, if you've got a public blog, like let's say you're running something like a dev2 kind of inspired site where you want the community to be able to write articles, open authoring would let somebody propose an article and it goes into a moderation queue. So that kind of allows you to accept guest posts from anyone without having to like approve their accounts or anything, but no one can actually publish. They can only put things into a moderation queue until someone actually edits and approves it to go live. So it's a really interesting community model. And I think for developer focused sites and communities, it's a great tool. Because it's so heavily invested in Git, it can be a little tricky for people who aren't familiar with using Git. But I think that's, you know, like everything, it's got trade-offs, right? It's really, really powerful, assuming everybody has a little bit of requisite context for using a Git-based workflow. That's
a relatively new feature, right? The open authoring, or it's in like beta?
Yes, open authoring is new. I mean, so the Netlify CMS, I think it's probably important to call out. Like that's a community maintained project. We were the driving force at Netlify behind kind of getting it to a certain point, but it's like a community driven project now. So it's not like a core Netlify feature or product or anything.
I think I maybe underestimated when I read about the open authoring. I think that is actually a pretty nice feature when you're trying to have community-driven content, to not have the standard of some Git literacy to contribute some, you know, good community content to what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
We have some questions coming in on the
You
chat.
got some more?
Do and I need again contextual help with the next one. So Victor asks, could you explain how an SSR project gets served on Netlify compared to an SSG one? And I don't have any idea what he's talking about.
I got
Cassidy's
this.
been doing a ton of work on this.
I was going to say this is literally my job. So an SSG one, it just works. You upload it and it just works. You don't have to do anything. It's done.
We define terms.
Oh yeah, sorry. SSG is a static site generation. So that's something that has been statically generated, and it's just uploading a bundle that has been exported onto Netlify, and that's it. And if you use all of their latest features like get static props, get static paths, all of those things, then you're actually using the latest and greatest aspects of Next. They've been kind of moving a ton of their stuff to SSG, to this static site generation, and load it up and it'll work just fine. If you want to use SSR, which is server-side rendering things, that is involving a little bit more work, but really it's not too bad. And there's actually a package that was created by the community, and we're actually absorbing it and supporting the creators and kind of building a maintenance group around it called Next on Netlify. And if you look up Next on Netlify on NPM, you can find it. But what that does is it allows you to build your Next project like normal and use whatever SSG or SSR features that you want. But it is this NPM plugin where when you install the plugin into your application and then load it all on Netlify, it makes all of your SSR routes, all of the pages that need a server-side rendered aspect to it, into a serverless function. And so it'll all still work just as you expect, but it's using a Netlify function to load up those pages.
Okay, wow. So they both end up in origin-less deployments, even though there's a server-side rendering functionality needed in SSR. I'm just trying to process that. Could you explain to me again the technical difference, what happens between SSG and SSR now that I understand what they stand for, and I think I might understand what they do?
Right. So the SSG, the static thing, that's kind of what we've been talking about, the JAMStack way of building something so that way the user doesn't have to wait for something to load at all. It's already pre-built and it's out there on the front lines. And then with something like using the SSR and using something like this Next on Netlify package, and also sorry if you hear loud trucks outside, they always are here in the morning and all my calls are loud like that. But anyway, if you use that SSR side of things, using the functions, it does involve a little bit more load time because you are querying a function that has to be run and then called. And something that we announced at JAMStack Conf that isn't out yet is a term. It's called edge handlers, and that's calling functionality at the edge on the front lines of all the CDNs and everything, where it's called at the front where the user is, and that's which is kind of hard to explain. I've got to work on my explanation of that, but that is probably something that we will lean into more for next support once that is released.
So are Netlify serverless functions your own serverless, or are they backed by Amazon Lambda or anything like that? Lambdas.
AWS Lambda, yeah.
Okay, and so all of the same restrictions or strategies apply regarding whether they should be stateful or stateless, and that's just up to you. But
it's a Lambda function without having to deal with AWS.
Okay, but that probably restricts the depth that I can do with that, because there are some ways that a Lambda function could deploy a Docker and call to a Dynamo or an Aurora database and be stateful. Could I actually manage deploy a function like that through Netlify? Would that just be really, really, really confusing?
So I have, for example, a Hasura instance, which is an ORM over the top of Postgres. The Hasura team's going to be mad that I called it an ORM, but it's like a GraphQL layer over the top of a Postgres database. and that Postgres database lives in a Docker container, and I call that from a serverless function for several of my apps. And so you can absolutely set that up, and that's running through Netlify functions. I think that what you're losing when you so like what you gain by using Netlify functions is that you can put functions in a folder in your repo and they will just work. You don't have to set up deployment, you don't have to set up routing, you don't have to set up proxies. They're just going to function the way that you would expect them to work. What you lose is that really, really fine-grained control that Amazon gives you, where you can get, you go all the way, you put on your hip waders and get into the YAML, and you can make some pretty wild stuff in AWS land. But you'll know when you need that. And in my experience, you have to be going pretty far before you actually need to ever touch the config of a Lambda. Usually you can do it in different ways.
Okay, nice. Okay, thank you. That was all new territory for me. There's actually a next question as well. Does Netlify support pre-Gzipped or Brotli files? Obviously, Netlify will zip things at the edge because that's one of a typical function of an edge layer like a CDN. But can you provide just the gzip file and have it served like that? So not downloaded, I'm presuming, but like unpacked at the client level?
So it says, I know it will generate them on the fly, but will it use the ones I created myself?
That's a great question.
Because I know we support Brotli stuff, but it's us doing it ourselves.
Yeah, maybe this might be one to take to Twitter, Demetrius, because like I'm not sure why you would do that. So if you maybe want to send a little more context on like what the benefit is of doing that work on your own versus having it done automatically, that could be helpful in trying to understand. But to answer your question like straight up, I don't know. I've never tried it.
Chad, to you. Do you have a next question?
Yeah, I'm looking through my notes here. If we go back to Next a little bit, one thing that I noticed was one of the primary parts of its pretty simple API was support for AMP pages. Is there any way that you'd be able to maybe fill me in a little bit more? That's the first time I come across that term. And of course, I'm doing this kind of mental comparison of Gatsby to Next. And I go, okay, I can do that in a plugin with Gatsby, it looks like, but it seems to be part of the core API for Next. So what is it for, and what is it doing there? Why is it like a main level API part?
What are AMP pages?
So AMP pages, Google AMP, those are pages where if you've ever searched for an article or something on your phone, chances are if you're using Google, it will load an AMP page rather than the actual website's page. And Google claims, and you might have to correct me, Jason, if I'm wrong, Google claims that will optimize how search engines find you, that'll optimize how the page is loaded because it loads less gunk for the user and just loads the important article content. That is what's claimed. Some people do not like that AMP exists because it is kind of Google saying like, I own this page now, because it ends up being a lot of Google serving up content for people and owning pages and stuff. So that's kind of what AMP is. I can pretty much guarantee you've opened an AMP page and just not realized it, because it'll be like amp.google and then the article URL, and you'd have to.
Would all of my tracking and stuff and my marketing cookies and everything be present in that or stripped from it?
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
So AMP is the acronym is Accelerated Mobile Pages, and the what they've done is they've effectively restricted what you can use on a page in the interest of making pages work as quickly as possible. So for you could not create the really stressful ad bonanza that you get on a lot of content sites using AMP, because they don't provide the tools for that, and they won't publish a site that uses tools that they don't provide. So it's effectively they've provided a stripped down set of components that you can use to show videos, to embed things. So you can use any tools that they have explicitly provided tooling for, but not others. And this is a lot of where the contention comes in about AMP, because like what AMP is really good for is it showed people how to make pages fast. It removed a lot of issues with third-party scripts. It showed people how to lazy load, how to do, image placeholders as opposed to blocking the entire page render until images showed up. These are all concepts that existed before, but AMP codified it and then provided a way to incentivize it, where I think other, performance experts weren't able to in the past. The downside is, like, Google on mobile search, when you do a search now and you see article previews, those are AMP pages. And then you have to scroll down to see non-AMP results. So they've kind of used their position as a global monopoly search provider to really strong arm people into using this AMP format if you want to show up in search results. They also proxy all of those results under the Google domain. So you're going to go to like google.com/amp/yourwebsite.com/article name. And I really don't like, I'm very not fond of the walled garden mentality. And I'm really not fond of putting content under Google's control when Google has so regularly killed projects with not a lot of notice. So the thing that I think is it's very, very good that they push mobile performance forward and that they're driving people. And what I think we saw come out of that is a lot of companies started like adopting those practices without publishing AMP sites. So it's the same practices. Like, none of the practices AMP is doing are not available on the web. They're still using web technologies. So you can take those ideas and you can build those into really good mobile experiences. Actually, that's one of the things that Gatsby is really proud of, is that they have Gatsby images and they have the preloading schemas and they do all the background prefetching so that everything is really snappy when you load. But the thing that they've done, so like AMP was really good at that. It pushed technology forward, but then they also are a little bit of like a huge corporation throwing their weight around a bit and saying like, hey, you better use our stuff or else you're not going to rank as well. And I think that rankles a lot of people, myself included.
Yeah, and so as for how it's built into Next, the Google team worked with the Next community and developers to make AMP components, so that way you can build them natively in your Next sites. That was a much longer explanation than I expected for us to give on what that means, but yeah, that's what that is.
And those, when Netlify builds, those get distributed like normal.
So when you build an AMP site, you're actually building like two versions of your content. You'll have the regular version, and then you would serve like your content.com/AMP, which is an AMP friendly version that Google will index separately.
And Next does all that for you, makes that.
Yeah, any plugin that you find that supports AMP is just going to do like it'll auto convert whatever you've got into the AMP friendly format.
Got it.
The Google team has actually, the Google team has actually worked with the Next people on not just that, but they have done a lot of performance measurement stuff too. And that's more what I'm excited about, where you can measure time to first paint, you can measure specific like hydration things and stuff throughout your application. And they have little checkpoints where you can point that to your various analytics things, whether you're using Google Analytics or your own thing that you're rolling on your own. And it allows you to measure a bunch of performance stuff. And that's what I'm more excited about, that team has contributed to the framework, because that can lead to actual really solid benefits for how fast your applications can load.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So I have a question. What is the breadth of range of build tools that Netlify will recognize in a code base? Obviously NPM.
So in your netlify.toml, and sorry if I interrupted you just now, Jason. In your netlify.toml, when you load it, it has commands that can be called. And yeah, I think NPM and Yarn are what's recognized. I don't know what other build tools are recognized, but you can put in whatever commands you want in that netlify.toml that will build, bundle, run different things, and whatever build plugins you might add to be published.
I'm just comparing it in my mental model to Platform.sh, where we have different container types for, say, PHP or Node or Java or Go and Ruby, and each one of those has built-in logic to recognize the incumbent build system of that container type. So if the PHP container will look for a composer JSON or a composer lock file and run that. Ruby will install Python will run pip. Ruby will install the gems. And I was wondering if there's more breadth beyond npm and yarn in Netlify.
Yeah, we will detect, because like you can run you can use the Node versions, but we also have support for like we have Jekyll and Hugo. So Jekyll's Ruby, Hugo's Go. We have I can't remember what the name of the PHP static site generator, but like you can run those. We also, like, if you wanted to, you could run a straight makefile. Like our command can be arbitrary bash. So you can run, it's a Linux container basically. So whatever you can run on, I think Debian 16 is our image. You can run on Netlify. So what we've optimized for, I'm not sure, but you can install whatever you need. And then we'll cache that build image and like pull the resources across so that it's not a fresh install between builds. Now I'm saying all of that knowing that it is possible in the abstract, not having actually done it myself. So take all of that with a grain of salt.
So theoretically, with a lot of salt, you could run Maven and then download a Java static site generator and deploy the assets from that?
I mean, yeah, you could, because you have, as long as you can do it inside of, I think 20 minutes is our default timeout.
Oh, well, then Maven's out.
Sorry, Java.
Yeah, so, okay, that's really cool. We have 4 minutes left. That means there's only one thing left on my agenda. And Cassidy, I'm looking at you. I was wondering, so I before we started the show, I had to spill my heart of gratitude to Cassidy because I told her the best thing that happened to me in the last 2 weeks in my entire life was that I subscribed to her newsletter and read almost the entire history of it from issue 1 all the way to present. And one of the great features of the newsletter is that there's always a joke. So it's my great wish as the host of this show that we could close with an original, authentic Cassidy Williams joke. What do you got for us?
Oh, well, I didn't know you were going to just tell me to do a joke.
I tried to warn you.
So, did you? Okay.
In your newsletter.
Let me
pull one from there.
Yeah, but okay. So if it's a Cassidoo original, let me think. It's got to be a pun of some kind, and probably a poop joke. Let me think.
As a 2-month-old father, I'm going to really like that.
Okay. So there once was a boat that it took people to an island, and the island was called Pango. And it would take people to and from Pango, and it was this beautiful island where you could have just a nice hotel stay. It was a beautiful tropical island. And this boat was actually quite the trip, because what people liked about it was not so much the journey, not even so much the destination, but the glorious bathrooms on this boat. It allowed you to just sit on not just a porcelain throne, but platinum thrones. These beautiful toilets where you could just kind of let loose, have a lot of fiber beforehand, and just have a really great cleansing journey on your way to Pango. And so the boat was called It Takes Poo to Pango.
There you go. And I can't think of a better way to end a Deploy Friday episode than with a Poo to Pango Cassidy Williams joke. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jason. Thank you, Chad. And thank you to everybody who joined us today and asked questions. I really enjoyed it. Good luck to you both and Netlify, and see you later.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bye, everyone.
And we're off air.
Okay.